Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here. Let me get this in focus. Going to be talking about America moving towards war. We had just talked about the Holocaust. We just talked about how the Axis powers attacked the world and how the United States was trying to stay out, but things happened. The United States basically realized what was happening in Germany as Germany is thundering across all of Europe. Roosevelt is realizing the drastic needs to get prepared for possible war, even though he's trying to also tell his voters, like, we're not going to war. So they did revise the Neutrality Act in 1935. And we see at the same time that, he was also preparing the war, people for war. He saw what was happening. He saw that the United States was going to have to probably enter war, and that possibly that things were going to go bad. In September of 1939, Roosevelt ultimately is talking with Congress about a cash and carry provision where basically, to help out Britain, to help out France, to help out their allies over there that, they're running out of weapons. They could use weapons. If they can come pick up weapons, the arms, then and pay with cash, then we'll and transport it back, then we'll pay, we'll sell it to them. The problem is, as this is happening, there's still isolationists who are still against this, and even though we're trying to help them defeat Hitler. The problem is also, too, this is a little bit too late because from 1940, France had already fallen to, and Britain was already kind of under siege and didn't really have a chance to do this type of deal. So Roosevelt basically at this point in time realizes how important Winston Churchill is, how important Britain is during this time. And so he's doing everything he can to kind of scramble and get some guns together to send over to Britain. And, so we're seeing 500,000 rifles, 80,000 machine guns. In early September, the United States traded 50 old destroyers for leases on the Britain military bases in Caribbean and Newfoundland. Right here in blue is your definition for Axis powers, by the way. So the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is definitely feeling this and thinking this is great, and thank you for doing this. And this is an undecidedly unneutral act, is what he said. And even though, yes, it was in some ways favoring Britain and kind of getting us involved, it was a way to at least help out our allies without getting involved in this war. By physically sending people over. But around this same time, on September 27th, we see Germany, Italy, Japan sign the mutual defense treaty, to form what is called the Axis powers in the tripartite pact. And under this treaty, basically, they kind of set the grounds that if the United States were to attack either one, they would declare war on the United States. It was kind of a way to protect themselves from the United States. And meanwhile, Roosevelt and Congress look to increase spending, national defense. We do see that in spite of the years of the isolationism, Nazi victories in 1940 changed United States thinking, and Congress boosted the defense spending. We start to see that more and more of Congress is seeing what Hitler's doing and starting to go, okay, there's a really good chance, and we could go to war, but we don't want to be, caught off guard. So Congress does allow the passing of the Selective Service Act, which is one of your definitions, to basically set in place a draft where 16 million men between the ages of 21 to 35 were registered, and we see about 1 million will be drafted in for 1 year. Eventually, that's going to increase once we go to war. So Roosevelt himself even drew out the first draft numbers and knew of how important this draft was in their preparation for the war. And at the same year, Roosevelt also decided to break the tradition of the two-term president, because before that, the amendment wasn't put in place to basically limit presidents' powers. It's until after Roosevelt dies that we start to introduce the amendment to hold presidents to 2 terms. So we see Roosevelt, previous presidents basically follow the George Washington format precedent. Precedent is very important in this country with our, governments and as well as our our court system. And George Washington, didn't run for reelection after 2 terms, and neither of the other presidents. And so Roosevelt, decides, hey, look, we're about to go to war. It's important that I run. And what helped is that, the Republican candidate wasn't very good. Wendell Willkie, nothing against the guy. He was a utilities executive. He had good policies. The problem is he agreed with FDR's policies. Some of his policies were FDR's policies. Well, when the American public's going to go vote, they're going to go with the guy who has more experience. And that ultimately was what happens. And we see that there was really too much of a difference between the two candidates. And so people voted for Roosevelt, and he got about 55% of the votes cast that year. And so not long after his election, we see Roosevelt is on the radio, talking about what's going on in Europe, and in his fireside chat saying it'd be impossible to negotiate peace with Hitler. This is pretty much like no man can tame a tiger into a kitten by stroking it. So basically he's saying is that there's just no way of getting through to this guy. And so he warned that if Britain fell, then so would the Axis powers would conquer all of Europe. And he kind of urged the importance of understanding how strong a threat the Axis power was, and trying to protect democracy, the great arsenal of democracy. So we see that late 1940, however, Britain had no more cash to spend at this point in time. They could not really buy any sort of goods from the United States. So Roosevelt suggested a new plan called the Lynn Lease policy. We're basically under this plan, and it's the Lynn Lease Act here. Under this plan, the president would lend or lease arms and supplies to any country whose defense was vital to the United States. And so this helped them help their allies and their neighbors and prevent. And so he basically, one way he sold this to isolationists and others who were kind of against going to war, he said, when it came to your neighbor's house being on fire, you would lend a garden hose to a neighbor. And then he asserted that it's the only sensible thing to do to prevent the fire from spreading to your own property, in which that was one way to do it. But isolationists argued that bitterly against the plan, but most Americans favored it, and Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. So also the problem, though, that I think a lot of individuals at this time had an issue with was Stalin, supporting a dictator. Joseph Stalin wasn't the greatest guy. He was a dictator, for one thing. And, it felt like by supporting Stalin, you're almost kind of supporting a Hitler, which is partially true. So, but the other thing, too, he used this, the coin term, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so Roosevelt began to sending the Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union to help them. And he realized that eventually you're going to have to rely on Stalin to beat Hitler. Even Winston Churchill said if Hitler invaded hell, the British would be prepared to work with the devil himself. And so the great arsenal of democracy was under attack. And so we start to see that the Germans are really putting the pressure, the squeeze on the Soviet Union and Britain over there. And so providing aid for them was a big deal. And so getting across the Atlantic Ocean was a bigger problem, because Hitler was also bringing German U-boats to try and sink our ships. And so we see from the spring through the fall of 1941, individual service attacks by the individual U-boats gave way to what became known as the Wolfpack attack. As they attacked at night, 40 submarines patrolled areas in the North Atlantic and where convoys could be expected. The Wolfpacks were successful in sinking 350,000 tons in shipments in a single month. And we see in June 1941, President Roosevelt basically gave the Navy permission of U.S. warships to attack these U-boats in self-defense. So in late 1943, the submarine menace was contained by electronic detection techniques and radar. Now, here's the thing. 1943. That's a little bit later on, which there's a key date, 1941, which we'll talk a little bit about that here pretty soon. So at that point in time, we're in the war in 1943. Although Roosevelt was popular and his foreign policy was under constant attack by isolationist Americans, and, they felt like, and as well as you got issues going on in Europe, American forces were seriously underarmed. Roosevelt in August 1941 proposed to extend the draftees pass, and it did work by only one vote, though. one vote passed in the House to continue the drafting, and we see that with the Army provided for it, we see that Roosevelt is starting to plan for the next war. And you see here Atlantic Charter is right there in blue. And also what ends up happening is even though Congress voted for the extension, while Congress voted for the extension of this draft, Roosevelt is secretly meeting with Churchill, talking about possibly getting involved. And they met on the battleship of USS Augusta. And although Churchill hoped for a military commitment, he settled for a joint declaration of war aims with what was called the Atlantic Charter. Basically, both countries pledged the following: collective security, disarmament, self-determination, economic cooperation, and freedom of the seas. Basically, they were going to do everything they can to protect their economies and protect Britain. And basically, the United States was letting them know, like, we're also ready to go to war if we have to go to war. So Roosevelt disclosed to Churchill that he couldn't ask Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, but he would wage war and do everything to force the incident. Basically, he was trying to push the issue. He knew that he had to go to war. But again, it's kind of that game of chicken. The United States doesn't want to draw first blood, but we're going to see what opens up that door. But the Atlantic Charter opened up this new document called the Declaration of the United Nations, which would bring nations together, and suggested by Roosevelt to express the common purpose of the Allies. And those nations had fought the Axis power. The idea that we're against war, we're against fascism, we're against violence and destroying the world economy. So we got to protect that. And this declaration ultimately would be signed later by 26 nations, 4/5 of the human race, observed Churchill. And so this would be greater down the road in uniting, as it says, the nations. We do see that FDR does plan for war, and we see that he's getting ready. We see after German submarine fired on U.S. destroyer Greer in the Atlantic on September 4th, 1941, Roosevelt ordered Navy commanders to respond, basically saying that when you see a rattlesnake, you're poised to strike, you got to crush him, and prepared for attacks on Germany. 2 weeks later, we see Pink Star, an American merchant ship, was sunk off of Greenland. And then mid-October, a U-boat destroyed the U.S. destroyer Kearney, and 11 lives were lost. Still, we have not gone to war. We're kind of pushing that line, but yet it's not enough to get Americans to go. We should get in war. Later, German U-boats sink U.S. destroyer Reuben James, killing more than 100 sailors. Americans had been attacked, and even he announced grimly, the shooting has started, and history was recorded who fired the first shot, which basically was pointing the finger at the Germans. As the death toll mounted, still, the Senate finally repealed the ban against arming merchant ships. So we're starting to see that at least they're getting on board of protecting themselves. But former declaration of full-scale war seemed inevitable. The Senate was still trying, dragging its feet. The people were. But although Roosevelt was popular and foreign policy was under constant attack, American forces were seriously underarmed. Roosevelt knew how much of this needed to be fixed. And again, we see again more of this is extended. And with the Army provided for, the Roosevelt began planning for war, and certain would come. We do see that Japan at this point in time has been able to succeed with expansionism with the Germans, and with them being a part of the Axis powers, they're continuing to expand with their control of Manchuria. In July 1937, Hideki Tojo, who's the chief of staff in Japan, and Japan's Kwantung Army launched an invasion into China. As French and Dutch British colonies lay unprotected in Asia, Japanese leaders are also going after East Asia under Japan control and seize those colonies' lands. And we see by 1941, British was too busy dealing with Hitler to deal with Japan as it went after some of those French colonies and over there in Asia. Only U.S. was its only a way to get those islands. We're talking about Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, but we see that becoming an issue. So what we see ends up happening is that the United States ultimately is the only one that could act on Japan because of their actions on the islands owned by or controlled by the French. And so in a protest and a new act of aggression, they cut off trade with Japan, attacking their military base for attacking bases in Indochina. And mostly the trade embargo focused on what Japan needed most, and that's oil, preventing them from getting what they need, which was really going to hurt their emissions and abilities in this war. And so Japan's military leaders warned that without oil, Japan would be defeated without its enemies ever striking a blow, because they realized that was the only way to keep their ships going, their navy going, which was a big, strong part of their military. The leaders declared that Japan must either persuade the United States to end its oil embargo or seize the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. And we see this meant possible war. And shortly becoming the Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo had visited the emperor at this point in time. And this is, by the way, your definition for Hideki Tojo. And he basically explained to the emperor, like, yeah, we're going to work with the United States. We're not going to get into a fight, because the emperor's like, good, because I don't want you doing that. Work with the Americans. You can figure this out. Find some peace. But on November 5th of 1941, he said, scrap that. Secretly, he told his men, let's plan an attack on United States base. And we see in the United States, they had broken Japan's secret communication codes, learned of a possible strike, didn't know exactly what they were planning, but they knew a strike was possibly going to happen on a U.S. base. We do see that late in November, Roosevelt sent out a warning that possibly it could be in Hawaii, Guam, or Philippines, but they didn't know. So if war could not be avoided, warning said the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. And so we see that the nation waited, but peace talks went on for a month trying to get Japan to stop. But basically Japan, really just didn't find any common ground. And they knew that they cut it off on December 6th of 1941. They cut off any sort of talks. And so Roosevelt knew this meant war between them and Japan. Not working out a deal with the embargo. So early that next morning, we see that Japanese dive bombers would swoop in low over Pearl Harbor early in the morning at the U.S. Naval Base in the Pacific. Basically, what ended up happening is that they had some aircraft carrier not too far off in the ocean, and this bomb carrier, as well as this bomber, as well as these 180 planes, warplanes, went in and launched aircraft carriers. I take that back. They launched from 6 aircraft carriers, but they swooped in and they targeted, and there was a raid on Pearl Harbor. And it was not a drill this time. And so within that first hour and a half, the planes swooped through, taking out U.S. anti-aircraft guns and blasted targets after targets, destroying battleships and any sort of ships that seemed deadly that could take out any sort of weaponry of the Japanese themselves. But what ends up happening, though, is many men lose their lives. One of those being the Oklahoma, USS Oklahoma, and USS Arizona, which Arizona is most famous one, sunk with many men who were just sleeping, getting ready for the day, and woke up to this attack. And so 2,403 Americans wounded, 1,178 more injured. The surprise raid had sunk or damaged 21 ships, including 8 battleships, nearly a whole U.S. Pacific fleet. So basically, the Japanese took out a bunch of aircraft as well, 300 aircraft, took out battleships, took out other ships. But luckily, 3 aircraft carriers were at sea and escaped the disaster and survived. And that is going to be key when we talk about the war in the Pacific. But anyway, in Washington, overnight, things changed. The moods of isolationists would soon go away. In Washington, D.C., we see that the mood went from outrage to panic as Roosevelt realized how deeply disturbing this was, losing a lot of its ships, its men, to this attack, and basically a good chunk of their whole navy. And so, his wife could see the pain, could see what was going on. And so, and basically Roosevelt told his wife, we haven't the Navy to fight in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. So we'll have to build the Navy and the Air Force. And that will mean that will have to take a good many defeats before we can have a victory. So meaning he realized that they're going to take some blows before they can get back to at least full strength or somewhat near full strength. And so Roosevelt realized the challenge ahead and that they were going to go to war. And so he had an address the next day and said, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date in which we'll live in infamy. He said the Japanese launched an unprovoked and dastardly attack. And so Congress quickly approved to request declaration of war in Japan. Once we declared war, because Japan was with the Axis powers, had that agreement, then Germany declared war on us, and so did Italy following that. And then once Pearl Harbor had happened, the isolationism kind of went away at that point in time. So many who had been former isolationists who now supported all out American efforts and basically were claiming we need to go and take out the Japanese. So this led us to war and changed the game for the United States. So, all right, well, that's going to do it for the chapter. We got chapter 17, which is going to go into more specifically about this. We'll talk about it then. See you guys.